Iran's president went on national television and asked his people to sit in the dark. He asked them to turn on 2 lights instead of 10. He asked them to conserve water through the night while the pumps are off. And the moment that broadcast went out, every Western analyst, every American think tank, every Israeli intelligence assessment started circulating the same narrative. Iran is collapsing. The regime is finished. The people are about to rise up and end this. The end is near. I have heard that sentence about Iran approximately 47 times in my professional career. I want to tell you something about all 47 of those times. Every single one of them was wrong. And before you decide that the 48th time is different, I want to walk you through exactly what is actually happening inside Iran right now, because the picture is more complicated, more painful, and more strategically significant than either the regime's propaganda or the Western collapse narrative is prepared to admit. Let me tell you about a pattern I have watched repeat itself throughout my professional life. When a government is under pressure and wants public support for a policy that is producing uncomfortable results, it reaches for the imminent collapse narrative. If the enemy is about to fall, you don't have to question the cost. If the enemy is on the verge of collapse, you don't have to ask whether the bombing is working. You just have to hold on a little longer, and everything will be justified by the outcome. I heard this about Saddam Hussein's government. I heard it about the Taliban. I heard it about the Assad government, which is actually gone now, but took 12 years longer than the imminent collapse people predicted. I have heard it about Iran roughly 47 times. And every single time, the imminent collapse was not imminent. So when I see the narrative building again, I want to slow it down and look at the evidence, not because I am defending the Iranian government, because I am defending the analytical standard that should govern these assessments. Let me start with what is unambiguously true, because the humanitarian reality inside Iran does not need to be exaggerated and should not be dismissed. The energy crisis is real. The electricity outages in Iranian cities are running 4 to 8 hours per day in many provinces. Southern Tehran, where working class and poor families live, is experiencing outages 32% of the time. Northern Tehran, where the wealthy and the politically connected live, is experiencing outages 1% of the time. That inequality in the distribution of suffering is not incidental. It is the specific signature of a system where the IRGC controls the energy infrastructure and the connected class protects itself while the population absorbs the cost. The food situation is real. Inflation reached 105% over the course of this conflict and the period preceding it. Meat has become a luxury item. 7 million Iranians have experienced hunger, according to government-adjacent reporting that almost certainly undercounts the actual figure. The Mobarake steel factory in Isfahan, Iran's largest, has shut down, putting tens of thousands of workers out of employment and cascading job losses across the automotive and construction sectors that depend on it. Port operations at Shade Rajay, which handles 85% of Iran's container traffic, have slowed by 40 to 60% because electric cranes and cold storage require power that is not consistently available. These are real numbers describing real suffering being experienced by real Iranian families. And none of them tell you what the Western collapse narrative claims they tell you. Here is the specific analytical error that every collapse prediction about Iran makes, and that this one is making again. It conflates civilian suffering with regime collapse. These are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing in the history of modern warfare. During the Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany in World War II, German cities were reduced to rubble. Civilian casualties were staggering. Food shortages were real. Infrastructure was destroyed on a scale that makes the current Iranian situation look mild by comparison. And German industrial production went up during the bombing campaign. It became more efficient. The will of the German population to resist was not broken by the destruction of the cities they lived in. The government did not collapse. The military did not surrender because civilians were suffering. I am not drawing a moral equivalence between Germany in 1944 and Iran in 2026. I am drawing a strategic equivalence between the analytical mistake that the Allied planners made, the belief that enough civilian suffering would produce political collapse, and the mistake being made right now. The suffering of Iranian civilians as devastating as it is, does not translate automatically into regime collapse because the mechanism that converts civilian suffering into political change requires a specific set of conditions that are not present in Iran today. Let me tell you what those conditions would require and why they are absent. For civilian suffering to produce regime change, you need an organized political opposition with a credible alternative. Iran's organized political opposition has been systematically destroyed over decades of IRGC surveillance, arrest, and execution. The protests that erupted over economic conditions, the largest since 2022, were suppressed with a ferocity that produced a death toll the Iranian government puts at 3,000 and opposition sources put at 36,000. The regime has demonstrated repeatedly and without ambiguity that it will use whatever force is required to maintain power. You need a military or security force that is willing to defect rather than suppress. The IRGC is not that force. The IRGC controls the energy sector. The IRGC controls the ports. The IRGC controls the crypto mining operations that were consuming electricity meant for civilian use. The IRGC is the primary beneficiary of the system that is producing the suffering. And the IRGC is the organization whose missile forces have been firing continuously for 62 days without running out of weapons. An organization whose missile inventory was supposed to be depleted in the first week is still firing on day 62. That is not a collapsing military force. You need a government that lacks the information security to prevent organized resistance from forming. Iran shut down its internet infrastructure during the protest crackdowns. It has demonstrated the technical and organizational capability to prevent the kind of networked opposition formation that brought down other governments in the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring governments that fell were governments whose militaries decided not to shoot. The IRGC shoots. Let me now address the specific economic data points that the collapse narrative is using, because they deserve careful examination rather than simple acceptance. The Iranian rial has fallen to 1.1 million rials to $1 from approximately 42,000 rials to the dollar in better times. That is catastrophic currency devaluation, and it is consistent with a country under severe economic stress. What it is not consistent with is a country whose military is incapable of continuing operations. The IRGC's missile program does not run on the rial exchange rate. It runs on domestic production, on the underground facilities that 62 days of American and Israeli airstrikes have not destroyed, on the institutional knowledge of engineers and scientists who have been working on these systems for decades. The collapse of the currency destroys the purchasing power of Iranian families. It does not destroy the Fatah 2 production line. The distinction between civilian economic collapse and military operational collapse is the distinction that every narrative predicting Iran's imminent defeat consistently fails to make. And the failure to make that distinction leads to analytical predictions that have been wrong 47 times and are wrong again now. I want to give you one specific number that captures the absurdity of the collapse narrative better than any argument I can make. The Bitcoin mining farms that the IRGC was running inside Iran were consuming approximately 2,000 megawatts of electricity. That is electricity that was supposed to go to Iranian homes and factories. The IRGC was running illegal crypto mining operations that were generating $7.8 billion annually, while Iranian civilians sat in the dark. The war shut down those mining farms because there is no power to run them, which means the electricity crisis, as devastating as it is for ordinary Iranians, has also shut down one of the IRGC's most profitable shadow economy operations. The IRGC is now losing revenue that it was generating at the expense of civilian consumption. That is not the picture of an organization whose strategic posture is collapsing. That is the picture of an organization that built a system so extractive that the sanctions and strikes designed to break Iran are instead breaking the specific corrupt operations that the IRGC ran against its own population. The ordinary Iranian family losing 4 to 8 hours of electricity per day is experiencing the same energy crisis that shut down the IRGC crypto farms. They are both casualties of the same system. The difference is that one of them voted for it and profits from it, and the other one never had a choice. Let me address the water situation specifically because President Pezeshkian's televised appeal is being cited as the definitive evidence of regime desperation. And it is evidence of something. It is evidence of a water infrastructure crisis that predates this war by decades and was building long before the first American bomb fell on February 28th. The NIAC Council documented this in August 2025, months before the current conflict. Tehran's major dams had fallen to less than a tenth of their capacity. The water mafia, a network of government-connected illegal well drillers and agricultural water thieves, had been destroying Iran's water table for years. The Hormuz blockade did not create Iran's water crisis, it accelerated it, which means that even a perfect resolution of this conflict, even a complete reopening of the Strait of Hormuz tomorrow, does not fix Iran's water infrastructure. The structural problems exist independent of the war. And Pezeshkian asking his citizens to conserve is a government managing a crisis that long predated the bombing. It is not by itself evidence that the bombing is working. Now, let me tell you what the strategic picture actually shows, because the civilian suffering picture and the strategic picture are two different pictures being presented as though they are the same one. The IRGC on day 62 of this conflict is still firing missiles. The Strait of Hormuz is still under Iranian operational control, which is why the IEA has characterized the resulting supply disruption as the largest in the history of the global oil market. Oil prices are still above $100 per barrel. 45 million additional people around the world face food insecurity by June, according to UN projections, not because Iran's food system collapsed, but because Iran's Hormuz leverage is still working. Trump called Putin on April 29th not to discuss Iranian collapse, but to ask for Russian help getting out of a war that Trump cannot win militarily and cannot exit diplomatically without cover. You do not call the adversary strategic partner when you are watching the adversary collapse. You call them when you need their help. That phone call is the most precise indicator available of the actual strategic balance as of May 1st. And let me address the brain drain number because it is the most serious long-term threat Iran faces and the one that receives the least analytical attention in the collapse-focused coverage. An average of 2,300 additional border crossings per day at the Turkish border, 3.2 million internally displaced. Engineers, doctors, and technicians targeting Germany, which has a 28% preference rate among skilled Iranian immigrants. The long-term demographic consequence of that migration is genuinely catastrophic for Iran's recovery capacity. Every engineer who leaves takes irreplaceable institutional knowledge with them. Every doctor who leaves creates a healthcare gap that cannot be filled by someone with less training. Iran was already losing 150 to 180,000 skilled people per year before this war. This wave carries the potential to turn that into a generational hemorrhage that the Islamic Republic, whatever form it takes after this conflict, will spend decades trying to reverse. That is the genuinely alarming long-term picture, not the collapse of the regime in the next few months, but the erosion of the human capital that would allow any Iranian government, successor or surviving, to build something better. The suffering of ordinary Iranians matters. It matters morally, it matters strategically, and it matters politically in ways that the regime cannot simply suppress its way past indefinitely. But the Washington establishment and the Israeli government want you to read that suffering as proof that their campaign is working and that collapse is imminent. And I want you to read it as what it actually is. A government managing a structural crisis that predates this war, using a population's resilience as a strategic asset, while its military continues to operate from underground facilities that 62 days of the most intensive American air campaign since the Gulf War has not destroyed. There is a human story inside all of this data that I do not want to lose in the strategic analysis. Iran has 365,000 registered truck drivers. These are the people who move food and goods across a country that cannot receive adequate imports because the ports are disrupted. They were already in economic crisis before February 28th. In May 2025, a truck driver strike spread to 155 cities. Port workers at Shahid Rajai had already staged coordinated work stoppages. Steel workers at Mubarakeh had already been furloughed. These were the cracks in the Iranian domestic economy before a single American bomb fell. The war and the blockade did not create these cracks, they widened them. And the people who are living inside those cracks are not strategic assets or narrative props. They are human beings who had a bad situation made catastrophically worse by decisions made in Washington and Tel Aviv that were not about them and were not designed to help them. The Trump administration launched this war on the stated premise of protecting American security from Iranian nuclear weapons. The Iranian families sitting in the dark with spoiled food and no clean water are experiencing the humanitarian cost of that premise without having had any vote in whether it was justified. That moral reality deserves to be stated clearly alongside the strategic analysis and alongside the specific demographic data that represents Iran's most serious long-term wound. The UN projects that 45 million additional people globally could face food insecurity by June if this conflict persists. That number is not Iranian. That number is the rest of the world experiencing the downstream consequences of a war that produced the largest oil supply disruption in the history of the global market, according to the IEA. Ethiopia, Kenya, Mauritius, South Sudan are experiencing fuel shortages because of Hormuz. India's LPG prices have nearly doubled. Australia faces potential diesel shortages for its mining operations. New Zealand released 6 days of petroleum reserves. The Philippines declared a state of emergency. All of these countries, all of these people, all experiencing the downstream consequences of a strategic decision made in Washington about a nuclear program that the State Department's own top counterterrorism official said posed no imminent threat before the first bomb fell. The darkness in southern Tehran is one piece of this picture. The 45 million people facing hunger by June is the same picture seen from outside. And the regime in Tehran is still in power, still firing missiles, still controlling the Strait, still not collapsing. That moral reality deserves to be stated clearly alongside the strategic analysis that says the regime is not collapsing, because both things are true simultaneously. The Iranian people are suffering catastrophically, and the regime is not going anywhere in the near term. And both of those truths need to be held together rather than allowing either one to erase the other in service of a narrative that somebody finds politically convenient. The collapse narrative serves the administration that launched this war by suggesting that the suffering is working and that the end is near. The no collapse narrative serves nobody's political convenience, which is, in my experience, usually a reasonably good sign that it is the more accurate one. The people sitting in the dark in southern Tehran deserve the truth about their situation more than they deserve to be instrumentalized in a narrative that serves the interests of the governments that are bombing them.